The Sum of Their Parts, written by Holdmybeer. Chapter 6. They started to work their way through the information from the Lestranges on the first day of August, in between learning new spells and mercilessly drilling Harry in the ones he already knew. A few days of sitting around in the library reading sounded great even to Ron. 2 weeks of near non-stop trying to put Flitwick's advice into action had left all of them tired and sore and utterly sick of some of the spells. Harry liked learning magic. It stopped being fun when he spent hour after hour drilled in the same wand movements just to gain a few more seconds of speed or a fraction more precision in his casting. They all needed the break, and they needed to decide what to do with the information they had. Harry had read briefly through all of it, but didn't remember hearing most of it himself. He had been too busy holding the Imperius and had let the enchanted quill do the writing for him. Some of it was all but useless, some of it was priceless, but between Harry and George, they had wrung every last bit of information out of Rodolphus and Rabaston. The final result was a stack of parchment that would take days to go through properly. Blishwick had been useless. The Lestranges had been a gold mine. The quill had picked up every bit of the interrogation, including the discussion between himself and George. Harry had removed those parts. He would gladly own up to his own words, but he had no right to expose George the same way. There were 2 small, safe houses that Harry did remember clearly. He had already fished out those particular sheets of parchment and put them aside in the useful pile. The pile grew fast over the course of the day, and Harry wasn't sure if he was relieved to have his use of the unforgivables slightly validated like that. It would make it easier to use the curses again next time, but then he didn't need much help when it came to that. Those spells were entirely too useful to give up. We'll need to put the safe houses under the Fidelius, but the wards are solid. Not as good as the ones on the house we already dealt with, but perfectly acceptable. Both houses are from after Voldemort's defeat, and supposedly no one but the Lestrange brothers knew about them, Harry told his 2 co-conspirators when lunch rolled around. Small houses, but they kept them stocked with everything they'd need to stay out of sight for a couple of months. Food, potions, even galleons. With 3 of those houses to hide in, no wonder the Auras couldn't find them. They were bloody paranoid. Ron put a bundle of parchment on the table between them. About everything. Hermione picked up the notes, and Harry knew from her sharp breath the moment she realized what she was looking at. The diagram on the front page had already told Harry exactly what it was. The Malfoy Manor ward scheme and defences, in every last detail. Ron looked up from the parchment in Hermione's hand, and several plans for how to get past it. They intended to make the Malfoys pay for betraying their master, and the Weasleys for Bellatrix's death, Harry said quietly. Molly was the target at King's Cross. Not us, not Teddy or Andromeda. Molly. Bill's wards were strong enough they didn't want to risk an attack on the Burrow, but everyone knows when the students arrive at King's Cross, and it was no secret that Ginny was at Hogwarts. I don't know how accurate the Malfoy ward scheme is. I don't know if Malfoy has changed the wards again since. But the Lestranges believed it was accurate enough to risk once Malfoy stopped looking over his shoulder. The feeling of dread and relief was clear through the bond, and was as much from Ron as from Hermione. The Weasleys had been a target before, but that had been wartime. Not like this. You want to use this? Hermione's hand trembled slightly. You could get arrested or killed. Lucius Malfoy was one of Voldemort's most trusted. Narcissa Malfoy is a black. The public backlash if you were seen. He could always claim the Imperius, Ron interrupted bitterly. Worked great for them last time. I don't see why we shouldn't be allowed to do the same. Hermione ignored him. Harry, the plans. This would be cold-blooded murder. Harry didn't object to her assumption that he would be going after Lucius Malfoy with the intent to kill. The vow had given her a swift, brutal lesson in the lengths that Harry was willing to go to. And killing the Lestrange brothers wasn't? Sure, they had attacked first, but that didn't change the fact that it had been an execution, plain and simple. They tried to kill us. And Lucius tried to kill us in our second year. Harry pointed out quite reasonably in his own opinion. "Narcissa Malfoy saved your life. She lied to Voldemort for you." "For Draco," Harry corrected, "and I'm not going to go after her." He should. Every bit of common sense told him that. But Andromeda still considered Narcissa family despite it all, had told him about the occasional afternoon tea together as they got to know each other again as sisters, and Harry couldn't take that from her. He still had a slightly soft spot for Narcissa Malfoy for saving his life, for all that he had long since repaid his debt. But that would not have stopped him. For Andromeda and Teddy, though, he would give her a chance. One and no more. "And Draco?" "I won't deliberately go after him." Hermione didn't look like she entirely trusted his reasons. She didn't demand an answer, though. The effects of the vows still hung heavily between them, and she had been very careful with her words since. Draco Malfoy was an arrogant, bigoted arse, a pale shadow of his father, and even with the Malfoy money and influence behind him, he had never shown any signs of having inherited his father's political abilities. Far more important to Harry, killing Draco Malfoy would leave Narcissa Malfoy as the last living member of the Malfoy family, with a lot of gold and influence and a Black's compulsive need for revenge at all costs. A still-living Draco Malfoy would be insurance. Even if Draco himself didn't understand it, Harry had no doubt Narcissa would. If Harry could somehow get past their defenses to kill Lucius, he could do it again to kill Draco. She would still want revenge if it ever became common knowledge he was behind it. But with Draco's future well-being to consider, there would be limits to the risks she could take. Hermione gave up on that route of questioning and started on another instead. "They'll have house elves." The Lestranges took it into account. Hermione pursed her lips, obviously suspicious. Harry handed over the relevant page before she could hunt for it herself. "Kill them?" she demanded. "A strong stunner should do the trick," Harry defended himself. "I don't want to kill house elves. Hopefully we won't even need to do that. Even house elves sleep sometimes." Hermione was frowning, but she still returned the page to the pile. She knew him well enough to know that he wouldn't hurt the house elves unless he didn't have a choice. She didn't like the idea of stunning them, but Harry didn't see what the alternative was. Ron had been reading through the relevant pages while they had been arguing, and only spoke up when it became clear Hermione was done with her objections for now. "The plans are meant for 2 people. Harry nodded. "I'm going to ask George." Hermione's frown deepened. "Harry, no. I don't even know if he wants to help, and we'll need to train the spells until we have them down to wordless casting if he does, but—" He hesitated and tried to find a way to explain that wouldn't get him chewed out. In the end, he settled for the truth. "I know George won't hesitate. I trust you. I'd trust you with anything, but I don't want you to have to do that sort of thing. We have enough nightmares between the 3 of us." "But you're fine with George getting his hands bloody?" Hermione did not sound happy. "No," Harry admitted. "But I'm not going to stop him. He wants even, and I'm the last person to refuse that. Is it healthy? Probably not. If he says no, I'll find another way." "He never would," Ron said, a little resigned. Not after Fred, he didn't need to say. And there was yet another reason on the long, long list that Harry kept of just why he was doing this. Because the sort of world that took Fred from George and George from Fred because its adults couldn't fight their own wars was no world worth keeping. It wasn't healthy, no, and Harry genuinely feared he would end up with George's death on his conscience one day. But George wanted revenge, and Harry would never refuse that. Because it gave him someone powerful and trustworthy at his back, because it was George's life to use as he chose, and because if anyone Harry understood the need for revenge, he had a failed Cruciatus curse in his 5th year to show for it. Uncomfortable silence settled between them. When it finally grew too uncomfortable, Harry cleared his throat. "Ron?" "I don't like it," Ron said bluntly. "It's murder, plain and simple." He took a steadying breath, and when he breathed out again, his shoulders slumped a little. "It's also Lucius Malfoy. He tried to kill Ginny. He's the strongest financial backer in the Wizengamot, and he's bribing his way back into more power, even with a dark mark on his arm. The gold would go to his family, but the ferret doesn't have old Lucius's political skills. He'd be a lot less dangerous. We shouldn't have to do this. But no one else is going to do a damn thing to stop him. Yes, Merlin, damn it, yes. Both of them turned to Hermione, her eyes focused on the parchment, but with an expression that said she was seeing none of the words. Neither spoke, giving her as much time as she needed. When I was petrified, there were first years in the library when we left that day, Hermione eventually said, never looking up from the parchment. If it had been anyone else, if I hadn't used a mirror, if we hadn't realized what sort of creature the monster was, it was a thought Harry was already painfully familiar with. Judging from Ron's carefully blank expression, he wasn't alone. He could have killed dozens, hundreds, Hermione whispered, and he knew it, or he didn't care when he found out, because it would just be the impure ones, and no one did a thing about it, because he is Lucius Malfoy, and he has enough gold and influence to be untouchable. She finally looked up and met Harry's eyes. It will be premeditated murder. You can't get caught. I know. She took a shuddering breath. I don't like what it will make you and George. Harry sighed, but couldn't argue with that. I know. She held his gaze for long seconds, looking for something Harry wasn't sure what was. Then she sighed as well. There is nothing I can say to stop you, is there? You have a list, even if you've never shown it to us. You would like us to understand, at least, but you would do it alone if you had to. Pretty much, Harry admitted. They had their second chance, and some of them their third, fourth, and fifth as well, and the rest of us got to deal with the consequences. I'm done. This ends here. I'm not letting Teddy's generation grow up in another blood war. If this is what it takes, that's what I'll do. You could stop the remaining Death Eaters, but become the cause of the next war yourself, Hermione pointed out. I know. Harry had spent too long considering just that. Hermione sighed again, then she nodded. I don't like it, she finally said, but I won't stop you. And for now, Harry knew that was as much as he could hope for. Harry met George in the back office of the shop the following morning, carrying a heavily protected bundle of parchment. The Lestrange's plans, I'm going after Lucius Malfoy. George accepted the bundle with a sharp smile. I've been waiting for it. In the middle of August, an owl arrived with a letter from Susan Bones. The wording was a simple request for tea and catching up with an old schoolmate, a very Hufflepuff thing to do. Harry could read between the lines just fine, and he knew better than to underestimate the niece of Amelia Bones. The responding invitation included the address for Grimold Place and a promise to be available at any time that suited her. She took him up on the offer the following afternoon, barely giving the owl time to arrive with the notice to him. A quick talk with Ron and Hermione had sent them off to the Burrow for the day. If Susan wanted to discuss what they thought, she would, and the letter had been far too innocent to not be a blatant hint that she had questions she did not want intercepted. Then the three of them there to face just her would look borderline hostile. They didn't need to be physically present to follow the conversation anyway. The woman that greeted him when he opened the door was very different from the Susan Bones he had known from the DA. Like him, she had grown, and like all of them, she bore the scars of the war. Her face had grown harder, her eyes wary, and she had the physical build of someone who kept themselves in shape. She had plans to become an Auror, last Harry had heard, and it showed. Harry, she greeted. Susan. He stepped aside, and she followed him into the house after only a moment of hesitation. Neither of them spoke. Outside wasn't safe, and Susan was probably as paranoid as Harry was about privacy wards. Most of them had learned the hard way during the war. Dining room or office? He asked. Susan watched him for a moment. Office. Harry nodded and led the way. The room held his desk and chair, as well as 3 softer, more comfortable chairs and a small table. It was a little cramped, but the 3 of them had spent plenty of time there. With just 2 people and a sleeping part Kneazle, it left room to breathe. Susan settled down, and Harry cast the usual privacy wards. The way she tensed almost imperceptibly when he drew his wand said everything he needed to know. Mute appeared with tea and biscuits and was gone again an instant later. Susan's brow arched slightly. Her name is Mute, Harry said. "She's the former Lestrange house elf. The new owners of the house didn't want her, and she would probably never have found a new owner. The Lestranges cut out her tongue to keep her from speaking." Susan's lips became a thin line. "Charming, isn't it? A lovely example of wizarding behavior." An uncomfortable silence settled as they poured their tea. Then Susan sighed. "A number of us had plans to join the Auras after this year." "They should be grateful to have you," Harry said quietly. "They won't find a lot of applicants more qualified." "And that is the problem." Susan took a sip of her tea and seemed to consider how she should continue. "A lot of that credit goes to you. You ran the DA. You taught us. A lot of us owe our lives and our families to those lessons." She paused and just stared at him for a moment, hard brown eyes meeting unflinching green ones. Then she sighed again, and the weight of the world seemed to settle on her shoulders. "You stepped up when no one else would, even when most of us didn't believe you about Voldemort. You taught us to survive. We don't want to face you in battle, and I have the sinking feeling we will." "Not necessarily," Harry said, and knew it was a lie when he spoke the words. Susan's lips twitched. The amusement didn't reach her eyes. "And is that Harry or the Dark Lord Potter speaking?" It was unnerving to hear the title from a friend. It had been one thing with Neville, who knew what they were up to. It had still sounded strange, but nothing like hearing it spoken with the heavy seriousness that Susan Bones gave it. Then again, he couldn't blame her. Not when she was sitting in his home, under his wards. "To those who fought by my side, it will always be Harry," he said, and didn't quite answer the question. "Whatever happens—" "I can't support Dark Lord." Harry merely nodded. "I know. The Ministry will come after you with everything they have. If we become Auras, that includes us. They will not show mercy, not after 2 blood wars within 20 years. Harry took a slow breath. "I know. For what it's worth, I give you my word I will never go after you with the intent to kill, whatever your orders are, you and anyone else who stood by us in the war. I owe you that much. In return, you will extend the same courtesy to Ron and Hermione." "Harry, no. Fair's fair. Let me do this much for you, at least." Susan's expression was unreadable. "Not you." Harry spread his hands. "Dark Lord, I'm a legitimate target. A swift reductor would be preferable to Azkaban anyway. Ron and Hermione only got involved because of me." "Bloody hell, Potter!" Susan put down her tea and simply sat there for a long time, staring at the delicate china. Then she looked up. "Why?" Harry got up and brought a piece of parchment from his desk along with a quill. "Harry?" "Hermione based it on the DA contract," Harry said, and put the parchment in front of her. "I've said too much already. I trust you. I wouldn't have answered you at all if I didn't, but this isn't just about me." "Ron and Hermione?" Susan stated more than guessed. Harry did not respond, and Susan picked up the parchment and started reading. He could tell by the movement of her eyes when she reached the end and started back from the top again, reading slower this time. "Veritaserum, compulsion charms and similar. There was no way to make an exception for Veritaserum. We think the magic of the contract will protect the secret from most spells, but not from Veritaserum. Probably not from the Imperius either. You'll need to be able to resist that one yourself, but that's all we can offer." There had been no way to make an exception for legilimency either, but that was an exceptionally obscure kind of magic, and Hermione was almost sure that having the knowledge taken and not given would keep the contract from seeing it as a breach. Almost. They were equally almost sure that having the information ferreted out by Veritaserum would be seen as a breach and punished accordingly. Susan hummed softly as she finished the contract again. "Risky to sign? Will anyone be able to see the signatures?" "Hermione, who created it, and anyone she allows. No one else. I won't make you sign it. We won't make anyone sign it. I guess we let ourselves be selfish for once. I know the contract might end up killing someone, but I won't risk Ron and Hermione. We'll burn it when it doesn't matter anymore, but until then..." "You grew up while the rest of us were in Hogwarts." "We all did. None of the returning 7th years are children anymore either. The war saw to that." Susan nodded. Then she picked up the quill and swiftly signed the contract. Harry saw the parchment flare slightly and felt the magic shift to adapt to the signature. "Why?" he repeated her question. Because I want a safe world for my godson. Because having a werewolf father doesn't make him worth any less than a pure blood. Because not a bloody thing changed after the war, and at this rate we'll be facing another Voldemort in 20 years at the most. Lucius Malfoy is bribing his way back into power even faster than he did the first time. The Ministry is full of Voldemort collaborators that no one will do something about because it'll mess up their nice, orderly lives. And can't we just forgive and forget? Kingsley Shacklebolt got so tangled up in politics that he's effectively useless. The Wizengamot is more interested in restricting part human rights than doing anything to fix society. And when I refused to be the Ministry's pet aura, I became a problem instead. And you think you can do better? I don't know, but I'm willing to try. Susan nodded. You do know that a safe, just world of equal rights would see you put on trial next to Voldemort's inner circle. Harry gave her a wry smile. Well, I'd hope as a Dark Lord I warranted a little more than just another trial. Harry. She made his name sound like a sigh. I know. I just don't particularly care. Susan sighed. I noticed. Where does this leave us, then? I signed the contract. How much will you permit me to share with the others? Harry paused. Who exactly are they? I'm here on behalf of Dean Thomas, Anthony Goldstein, Ernie Macmillan, Hannah Abbott, and myself. That was an eclectic list. 3 potential aura candidates, and Hannah and Ernie are considering the auras. Not Hannah, but she's a dear friend, and she wanted to know. Ernie, a lot of things changed that year with Voldemort in power. Harry nodded. He knew that Hannah and Neville were stuck in an awkward little dance of maybe mutual interest, and with Neville's friendship with them, she had good reasons to want to know what her possible future boyfriend was involved in. Ernie had been in the DA. Harry had always seen him as somewhat stuffy and stuck up, but the war had changed a lot of them, and he had always been decent with a wand. Tell them that they will need to sign a contract, but once that's done, I will answer any question they have. Feel free to tell them that the contract is for secrecy alone and contains no other demands. Don't tell them the penalty. They'll see for themselves before they sign, and if they don't agree, I may need to remove the memories. Susan nodded. A reasonable precaution. Anything else? Harry hesitated as he tried to find a way to word it that wouldn't potentially come back to bite him later, if one or more of Susan's friends turned out to be untrustworthy. He doubted it, but... Tell them that I have my differences with the Ministry of Magic, but that it isn't my business what they choose to do, and I will hold no hard feelings if they join the auras. I assume they suspect as well? We pieced it together as a group. We've met and trained together over the year and became close friends in the process. We approached Neville. He, in turn, told us to go to you. You're not as subtle as you think. You've mostly isolated yourself and have grown significantly more powerful and skilled over the last year. You've sunk a lot of money into a foundation that, at its core, is set up to challenge the Ministry. Your home has been raided for dark artifacts, and you've been brought in for questioning for the Lestrange murders. It may not be the actions of a classic Dark Lord, but it's very different from the Harry we knew in Hogwarts. Harry nodded, accepting that. Tell them that whatever happens, I won't raise my wand against them with the deliberate intent to kill. They fought with us at Hogwarts. I owe them that. Tell them I expect the same consideration for Ron and Hermione from them. Should either of them be targeted, we'll see just how creative I can be with the Black Library at my disposal. I will let them know. Susan let out a slow breath. Thank you, Harry. Harry gave her a wry smile. Any time. Tea? Susan just laughed. When Susan Bones and Dean Thomas joined the Aura program in September, there were 4 new signatures on the parchment beneath Susan's name. Werewolf terror in St. Mungo's! The headline in the Daily Prophet, the morning after the full moon in late September, was as sensational as Harry would have expected. But for once it did the story justice of sorts. One werewolf in St. Mungo's on the full moon was all it took to destroy a year's worth of campaigning for better rights for dark creatures, and, Harry suspected, part humans in general by extension. One werewolf, 11 dead. 2 newly infected auras. They would turn by the next full moon. There was no hope they wouldn't, and a number of staff and patients that would at best carry their scars for life. By nightfall, dark creatures and those with dark creature blood had been permanently banned from St. Mungo's by order of the ministry. Teddy Lupin, with a werewolf father, was one of them. The Evans Lupin Foundation received an interesting request in early October. Harry found out through Ron and Hermione. "Lavender Brown wants to start a business," Hermione said, "but even just being tainted by a werewolf without being one herself is enough that no one is willing to lend her the money and that the ministry refuses her a permit for a shop, especially now." "You want the foundation to fund it?" Harry was genuinely curious. Lavender Brown had never struck him as having much ambition at all. But then they had all been forced to grow up, and she had lived with the visible scars of a werewolf attack for a year and a half. Even without the curse itself, she would still have faced all those charming, wizarding prejudices. Bill, at least, had been abroad and had the sort of career where gruesome scars were commonplace. The same had not been the case for Lavender. Her business plan is sound, and the idea goes well with the Foundation's purpose of helping those the wizarding world discriminates against. Hermione hesitated. She wants to create clothes with protective spells in them that don't go to the same extremes as aura uniforms and the like. Protection for those who can't cast a strong shield, for one. Squibs and children. Witches and wizards who didn't have the magical skills or gold for the supplies to attend Hogwarts. She's in contact with a part human that can do the spell work and knows the tailoring side of it herself. I think it looks like a good idea to me. Especially now, she didn't add. Especially with a rising Dark Lord, even if only a few people knew. None of them wanted innocents caught in the crossfire, but they all knew it was unavoidable. People might shun it for being made by tainted magic. Harry didn't quite manage to keep the bitterness from his voice. There would still be customers, though. Harry's practical side knew that too. "Some will," Hermione agreed. "We're still looking it over, but we want to give her a chance. We can afford it. The Foundation will hold the loan and the permit. The ministry won't be able to do a thing about it." Something in Harry's body eased a little, the same way it had when the Foundation had received its first donations that had not come as a direct result of Harry's lawsuits. The Foundation was finding its feet and, step by little step, stretching its abilities beyond what Harry had initially imagined. They were baby steps, but each made it just that little bit more likely that the Foundation would survive past his death. If nothing else, Harry hoped this would be his final gift for Teddy. Someone, something, with the gold and influence to fight for his place in the wizarding world if Harry himself failed. The Foundation was not the only thing taking up their time. Between the daily spell practice with Ron and Hermione, there was research and planning, spending time with Teddy and the few people they still socialized with, and frequent practice sessions with George. The attack on the Lestranges had been one thing. Going up against the defences of Malfoy Manor, even with the Lestranges' plans to guide them, was a daunting task. The list of spells they would need to be able to cast was some 24 long, a good half of which had to be done silently to keep from drawing attention by noise or magic both. In between it all, Harry had also found a small cottage in a reasonably isolated part of Wales. It was an older wizarding home that had been on the market for a few years and needed a bit of renovation. More importantly to Harry, it was several miles from the nearest neighbour, would pass quite well for a home, and it was priced very reasonably. The three of them knew it was only a matter of time before whatever home Harry claimed would be a target, and they all preferred if that place wasn't Grimmauld. Potter Cottage would be their decoy home. Realistic and homey enough to pass for the real thing, but a small enough investment that it wouldn't be a disaster if anything happened to it. Grimmauld Place itself was put under the Fidelius on Halloween, with George as the secret keeper, being the only one of the four who spent enough time away from the place to fulfill the requirements of the spell. It took significant amounts of magic, but surprisingly little time. After placing the Fidelius over the two Lestrange safe houses already, Harry had the casting down to instincts. They shared the secret with those that mattered, family and those friends close enough that it made no difference. When Harry gave the small slip of paper for Arthur Weasley to read and burn, the man closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, his face was no longer the slightly confused ministry official with a fondness for Muggle objects, but a tired, weary veteran of 2 wars. "Be careful," Arthur said quietly. "Molly can't lose any more." Harry didn't try to claim the Fidelius was for protection or privacy or any of the other excuses they had ready. Instead, he just nodded. "We'll try." That was all he could promise. Judging from Arthur Weasley's resigned expression, he knew it too. Luna cornered him in the orchard behind the burrow one lazy Sunday in early November. The weather wasn't great, but Harry had needed a break from the chaos of the weekly Weasley get-together, and magic would keep him warm and dry. The soft sound of steps among wet leaves made him turn around to see Luna approach him, the lights of the burrow far behind her. She looked good. He had noticed that before. She still looked perpetually surprised. But that was just Luna. Staying with the Weasleys had done wonders for the broken girl that had sought them out during Easter, and with Ginny still living at home and training for the Quidditch tryouts the following autumn, she was never really alone either. For a long time they stood there and watched each other, protected from the elements by spells. Then Luna lowered her eyes and curtsied. "My lord?" Harry took a step forward. "Luna!" She straightened and silenced him with a finger on his lips. He noticed absently that her nails had been painted a rainbow of colours, most of them clashing. Ginny still remembers Tom Riddle. She loved him too. She tapped her finger against his lips as a little reminder before she lowered her hand again. "You are not him, but Raxperts like Quidditch players. She already has a flock of her own. The Harpies will like her." Luna took a step back and smiled, a little dreamily. "I will stay with Ginny. She was my first friend and she shouldn't be alone. But if you find the minister's army of heliopaths, I would very much like to meet them." Harry was still trying to figure out what to say long after Luna had meandered back to the burrow. Dean Thomas dropped out of the Aura program in late November. Officially, he wanted to pursue a career that allowed him to focus more on his love of art. The unofficial story Harry got the following afternoon in Potter Cottage when Dean came to visit. With the 4 of them, Ron, Hermione, Dean and himself, it was a little like Gryffindor Tower again. "It's all politics," Dean said after the first glass of fire whiskey. They had all decided it sounded like one of those days. "Oh, there's training and classes and laws, and Merlin knows what else, but at the end, it's all politics. Even now, when they're trying to replace the people they lost, and the ones that got encouraged to retire after being a little too cosy with the Death Eaters. Knockturn Alley? Hey, who'd need a warrant for that place? Malfoy Manor? Better ask the minister first and give them a bit of warning, wouldn't be proper otherwise." "Just like the old days," Ron said, a little bitter but mostly tired. Dad tried to get them to search the Malfoys for years. He knew they had illegal things hidden, but nobody ever listened. And when they did, Malfoy got enough warning to have the time to hide it all. They didn't even bother giving Harry that. We'd finished cleaning up that place a few months before, but hadn't told anyone. The Black family had a lot of questionable stuff, and the Auras seemed like they were expecting to find something. Harry clarified at Dean's questioning look. "If we hadn't spent most of the autumn and winter renovating and clearing out the darker stuff, I would have had a problem." The Fidelius was a peculiar and powerful bit of magic. The article about the raid on Grimmauld was still there, but Ron and Hermione had tested it before George had shared the secret, and even seeing the article, they hadn't been able to make the connection between Grimmauld and Harry's home. Dean grimaced. "Charming. Much better use of Aura resources than hunting the remaining Death Eaters, right?" He swirled the glass in deliberately jerky motions and made the drink burp flames in a staccato beat. They didn't look at blood status when they picked the recruits, at least just our skills, but they're about the only ministry department that doesn't. And even then, you need political connections to get to the top. Susan could probably make head Aura one day. She's got the name and the connections. Even if I wanted, it would never happen. "How's she doing?" Hermione asked quietly. "Susan?" Officially, she's thriving. The instructors love her. Between the DA and what Amelia Bones taught her before the war, she's top of the class and a bloody terror to fight. Unofficially, she's just as disgusted with the politics as I am. But Dean took deep breath. We agreed that one of us should stay. You need an in with the Auras, and she's a lot more likely to make it through than I am. Besides, she's a Hufflepuff. Everyone trusts Hufflepuffs. Harry downed his own drink in a sharp motion. It burned all the way down, but didn't help the unease that had settled in his stomach. You don't have to. Not for me. Dean shrugged. We're not idiots. How many Death Eaters and Voldemort supporters have the Auras brought in since the trials last summer? How many are still wanted? And the ones they got, half of them got released with a slap on the wrist because the higher-ups don't want to deal with the consequences. Some Auras aren't even trying. They cleared out the worst of the sympathizers, but they missed or ignored a lot. Knott's got an older brother in the Force, Voldemort Bootlicker, if I ever saw one. I've seen the Lestrange case files. I don't know how you did it, mate, but I know you had something to do with it. I'm not looking for a confession, he continued, when Harry looked like he was about to object. And I've kept from asking you because it was too risky as an Aura recruit. But give us a little credit here. The Lestrange brothers attacked King's Cross, specifically targeting the Weasleys and the last members of the Black Bloodline. 2 days later, they're found dead, looking like someone did a lecture on the Unforgivables on them. There's been no mysteriously injured people in St. Mungo's, no rumours about who did it, and no reports of unexplained spell fire. This is after the Auras spent a good while trying to hunt down those two, because the Inner Circle are some of the few ones they've actually put aside the manpower for. I've already been questioned under Veritaserum, which isn't foolproof. Dean shrugged. As said, not looking for a confession, but even with that Veritaserum defense, you're at the top of the suspects list. They just can't pin it on you. Frankly, even with the Unforgivables in play, the wizarding public would be more likely to reward you for taking those two down than want you punished, especially after King's Cross. You need an in with the Auras because you're apparently the only person making a bloody effort to finally end this, and even if all we can do is warn you before a raid, then that's what we'll do. I'm a Dark Lord, Dean. As he should know, having signed the contract, but Harry needed to remind him anyway, because right now he sounded too much like a Gryffindor, like this was just another adventure, and Harry didn't want to risk any more friends than he already had. Yeah, Dean swirled the fire whiskey again, then downed it when the flames had died down. We talked about it afterwards, when we'd signed, and you know what we decided? When Harry Bloody Potter decides to become a Dark Lord, then maybe it's time to reconsider the side we're on. And not for power or revenge or whatever Dark Lords want these days. You're damning yourself to protect a toddler that happens to have a werewolf father. If that's what you have to do to keep him safe, what chance do the rest of us have against the Ministry and the pure-blood elite? To Harry, who'd never quite understood why they had been so ready to sign that paper, it was a sobering thought. Sobering and terrifying. Harry Potter never wanted to be a symbol. All he wanted was to be normal, with a normal life and a family and a job. And when it came clear he would never have it, he had decided to do what he could to make sure that Teddy would have the chance instead. He thought he had been done being a leader after Hogwarts. It was becoming increasingly clear that he had been very, very wrong. With St. Mungo's no longer an option for Teddy, Harry had been forced to look elsewhere for medical care for his godson. The toddler had been unusually tired 2 full moons in a row, and Harry and Andromeda both knew better than to assume it was coincidence. Dr. and Dr. Dunsfell were a husband and wife partnership located in a run-down part of Birmingham. The clinic was small and cramped and a little run-down too, but the wards that greeted him were some of the strongest he had encountered outside of old estates. He had found them through the Evans Lupin Foundation, who had in turn found them through several of the non-humans they had come into contact with. The 2 doctors used their Muggle job title to stay unnoticed and served as one of the few doctors' offices in the wizarding world willing to deal with all kinds of non-humans, supplementing their income with a small potion brewing store on the side. Teddy squirmed as they settled down in the waiting room, little more than a narrow hallway, and Harry reluctantly put him down. "Don't go anywhere," he said quietly. Teddy, perhaps a little unnerved by the unfamiliar smells, nodded. There was only one other person waiting with them, a pale man with dark circles under his eyes and a tremor in his hands, but he merely kept staring tiredly at his shaking hands, never looking up. He reminded Harry vaguely of Remus Lupin and wondered if the man was a werewolf too, but he dismissed the thought again almost immediately. He could be human for all that Harry knew. Not everyone had the ability to get to St. Mungo's, and the night bus was about the last kind of transportation any sick person would choose. The air was still, and the silence downright oppressing, and it was a relief when Harry heard the soft sound of a door opening. An elderly woman in robes stepped out, followed by a younger woman dressed more like a Muggle doctor than a St. Mungo's healer. They exchanged a few strangely muffled words. Harry suspected a privacy ward, and then the elderly woman smiled tiredly and left, carefully making her way through the cramped hallway. The female Dr. Dunsfell was a wiry-haired blonde even shorter than Harry. Being a witch, she could have been anywhere from mid-30s to early 50s, but Harry supposed it didn't matter much. She touched the shoulder of the pale man gently, and he looked up and shook his head slightly before he went back to staring at his shaking hands. The doctor didn't seem surprised, but turned to look at Harry and Teddy instead. "Mr. Morris and Son?" Harry nodded and got up, Teddy's hand held securely in his. He felt the privacy ward as they stepped inside the office proper, a strong, secure one, but he doubted he would ever really be comfortable with a privacy ward he hadn't seen cast himself. The office was light and airy, a little small, a little worn, with several chairs, and with things packed tightly on shelves and 2 floor-to-ceiling cabinets of nothing but drawers, but it was clean, and everything Harry knew about doctors and hospital wings told him it was a decent place. Dr. Dunsfell picked up a new piece of parchment and gestured for Harry and Teddy to take a seat. "You can release your glamour if you wish, Mr. Morris. It can't be pleasant holding it." Harry hesitated for a few seconds, then conceded and let the magic dissipate. He didn't want them to be recognized in the waiting room, but he was about to trust Teddy's health to this doctor. If he couldn't trust her enough to show who she was actually dealing with. The wards, he guessed. To her credit, she merely glanced at him, eyes flickering briefly to his forehead, before she answered the question. "I wanted to be a warder," she said, "until I learned that no one in Europe would even look at anyone who hadn't graduated from one of the 3 major schools. St. Mungo's wasn't as picky as long as you had the right grades for it. They couldn't afford to be, with the small number of qualified applicants they got. Warding remained a hobby. The clinic is a target. We would not have remained in business without additional security." Harry understood all too well. Another item on a long, long list of failings in the wizarding world. Dunsfell knelt on the floor and held out her hand to Teddy. "Hello," she greeted softly. "I'm Amanda. I'm a doctor." Teddy looked to Harry for permission, then back at his nod. "Teddy?" He pronounced the name very carefully. He was very proud of his name, Harry had found, and Dr. Dunsfell smiled. "A proper little gentleman." She glanced up at Harry, a question in her eyes. "He has his inoculation so far," Harry began. "He's not due for the next round of wizarding ones until he's 4. He always gets tired around the full moon, but it has grown worse the last 2 months. He doesn't change, but his father was a werewolf and his mother a human metamorph magus, and no one has been able to tell us what that might mean later on. Eating raw meat seemed to help, but there is only so much he can eat." Dunsfell didn't react to the werewolf bit beyond a nod. "You don't see human-werewolf couples very often?" she agreed, "and the wizarding world cares little for half-breeds." She drew her wand and cast a series of spells, a few of which Harry recognized from his frequent visits in the Hogwarts infirmary. At her side, hovering in the air, a quill faithfully scribbled its way across a piece of parchment. Eventually Dunsfell lowered her wand again. "He's generally in good health," she said. "He does have several vitamin deficiencies, though, primarily iron. We can repeat the spells later, but I suspect he will always need more iron in his diet than the average wizard, and certainly while he's still growing. I will give you the names of a few potions. You're a Hogwarts graduate. You will likely be able to brew them yourself, or I can suggest a few places, and then I recommend another checkup in a few months to see how he responds to it." She smiled at Teddy, then glanced at Harry again. He does not register as a werewolf. Save for those who know about his father's condition or highly specialized medical spells, he will register as human. The vitamin deficiency showing up now is a result of being a growing boy and a metamorphmagus himself, not because of his werewolf legacy waking up. He will probably enjoy his steaks rare, his teeth and nails will be a little stronger, and his hair will grow a little faster than normal, but that should be all. Dr. Dunsfell stood and plucked the hovering parchment from the air. She gathered a few more papers, collected it all in what looked like a Muggle medical journal, and handed Harry the slim folder. "We don't dare keep patients' files here. If you need to return, bring the file with you. It will speed up the process." "Thank you." Harry understood and appreciated it. The small pouch he gave her in payment contained far, far more than the visit had cost. It was still far, far less than what Teddy's health was worth. There were several ways to get past wards intended to keep intruders out. Some were fast and spectacular. Some were slow, but could with skill be done quietly enough to remain utterly unnoticed. Any ward was only as secure as its weakest point. The Black Wards had ignored 2 Horcruxes, one of them while Harry, who, if any, should know about them, held the wards. Even the Fidelius was only as strong as its secret keeper. Voldemort had favored the direct approach. He had been powerful enough to simply overwhelm most wards and cut off all means of escape in the process. He had also liked his victims trapped and terrified, as Harry knew entirely too well. The Lestranges hadn't had that sort of power available to them, nor had they wanted the sort of attention it would bring. Instead, they had used the kind of spells that required intimate, inside knowledge of the wards, and they'd obviously had that information. Once you knew the layout, you could start working with the wards and figure out the conditions. Once those were clear, it was just a matter of skills and patience to match those conditions well enough to pass. Effectively invisible to the wards and those that relied on them, human or house elf. The method was insidious and effective. Pretty much what Harry had come to expect from those Death Eaters that had actually been competent. Once they had the spells down, Harry and George had taken turns casting wards and getting past them, using the knowledge they had been given from the other. The Malfoy wards would be far more difficult, but the principle was the same. There was the risk that Malfoy had changed the wards since the Lestranges got their information, but Harry was willing to take the chance. If they got it wrong, it would be obvious almost immediately and would give them time to escape. Harry could very likely have taken down the wards with brute force. He knew better than to even consider it. The wards on the Lestranges' hideout had been one thing. These were far more powerful, and even the smallest misstep could bring the full might of the manor's defences down on them. That wasn't even taking into account that this was the home of a respectable, important member of Wizarding Society. The Aurors would likely be there within minutes of Malfoy's summon. If he hadn't been trying to spare Narcissa, if he knew the wards to cast to block Floo and house elves, maybe. Fiend fire for the wards, and once more for the manor. Even then it would very likely have taken long enough that the Malfoys would have been able to escape. Harry and George struck the second week of December, on a common weekday with absolutely no social events that could have kept Lucius Malfoy out of his home, or any overnight guests to complicate matters. They began their task shortly before midnight, when the manor seemed to have fallen quiet. It took the better part of 3 hours to get right, piece by piece, until they had the ward signature down perfectly. Even with 2 wands, power to spare, and everything but the actual blueprints for the wards, it was grueling work. Making it work with their disillusionment charms definitely hadn't made it any easier. Life had been a lot easier in Hogwarts when they had all been small enough to huddle under the invisibility cloak together. They passed through the wards easily, stopping right inside of them. The manor up ahead remained silent. The wards didn't make a whisper. As far as they were concerned, Harry and George both belonged on the property. Harry let out a breath he hadn't even noticed he'd been holding. "Well, through the gate," George murmured. "Yeah, if the Lestranges got it right, it shouldn't even notice us." And it was a much better option than trying to get across the tall hedge. They didn't want to cast any more magic than they had to until Lucius Malfoy was dealt with. Their disguise would not hold up to prolonged spell casting. They slipped past the gate with only the softest whisper of sound and found themselves in an utterly still garden. Utterly still, utterly immaculate, and more than a little eerie. "If we got it wrong, something should have happened by now," Harry finally said when the manor remained silent. George's smile was sharp in the moonlight. "Lucius, then? Lucius!" Harry's responding smile was no less sharp. Malfoy Manor was as creepy and opulent as Harry remembered. He, forcible, shoved aside the memories that threatened to take over and focused on the mental map he had memorized from the Lestrange plans. The house elves were likely in the kitchen, hopefully asleep. The bedrooms were upstairs, and they sneaked past one sleeping portrait after another, the dates beneath the names ticking upwards as they reached the long hallway lined with doors. They both had their wands out, ready to cast at the first sign of movements, but the hallway remained as it was, dimly lit and silent as a tomb. The master bedroom was the fourth door to the left, a large room with a balcony and a view of the gardens, according to the information the Lestranges had. Harry didn't know how they knew. He assumed Bellatrix Lestrange had told them at some point, being Narcissa Malfoy's sister, and he didn't particularly want to think about it. The level of some of the details in the information had been disturbing. There were no further defenses on the door, nothing but a few spells to silence the room and an easily disabled spell to alert the occupants to visitors, and it opened soundlessly to Harry's touch. The unnatural silence of the hallway was broken by the slow, deep breathing of sound sleep and settled again as they slipped inside and closed the door behind them. Two figures rested on the enormous bed, and Harry would recognize that platinum blonde hair anywhere. He held out his hand and counted down with his fingers from 3, 2, 1. "Stupefy!" Twin flashes of magic lit the room. Harry froze, waiting to see if the wards or the house elves or anyone reacted. Seconds stretched on, and finally they dared move again. George cast a second spell at Narcissa Malfoy. Harry vaguely recognized it as a more obscure variation of a stunner, then joined Harry on the other side of the bed. "Just in case," he murmured. "No need to risk anything. Legilimency?" Harry nodded and mentally prepared himself. They didn't have time for a full interrogation, couldn't risk that Lucius might be tracked if they brought him with them. It wasn't the most reliable solution, but his brute force, legilimency, was all they had. If that failed, he would try Veritaserum and the Imperius and get what he could from the man, but that would take more time than they could afford. They couldn't risk lingering. They had to be out again, fast. The Lestranges had planned to simply kill everything in the manor, starting with the house elves and Lucius Malfoy, and then take their time to be creative with Narcissa and Draco elsewhere as revenge for turning against Voldemort. They would have left no one to alert the auras. Harry and George would not have the same luxury. A silent spell from George forced Lucius's eyes open, and Harry raised his wand. "Legilimens?" Harry's mind plunged into a maelstrom of thoughts. Memories flashed by almost faster than he could spot them, spinning around and around, starting somewhere far below him and continuing into the distance high above. So far away, Harry could not see the end of them. He focused harder, concentrating on what he needed, on politics and Death Eaters and secrets, ignoring the memories of family and decadent indulgence, and the memories switched and slowed. Some were flickers, gone before he could see them. Others lingered long enough that he could pick them up, memories of power and gold and death, and he pushed further on, aware that they were on a definite deadline. Harry tore ruthlessly through the memories, snatching what he could with no care for the damage he left behind. It wouldn't matter, and he didn't care, not after everything Lucius had done, not after Hermione's petrification and his utter indifference to the deaths the basilisk could have caused. He was distantly aware of Malfoy's presence, of the mostly unconscious mind that fought to keep him out and tried to struggle against the stunner. The man definitely had occlumency training, and so did Draco, the memories told him, taking from the Malfoy side of the family, but Harry had raw power and no inclination to be subtle. With one last vicious push against the few remaining defences, he felt Malfoy's mind crumble and fall away beneath his assault. Something felt like it snapped, dark red and sharp pain in the back of his skull, pressure and numbness and the heavy throb of a heartbeat. Then there was only vertigo and darkness and fragments of what had once been a person, and Harry retreated so fast that he could feel the mental whiplash. Empty grey eyes met brilliant green. 2 lines of bright red blood flowed from Malfoy's nose and down his face to soak the pillow. The man was still alive. Barely. Merlin. Harry stumbled back. Then George was there, supporting him even as Harry dry heaved once, twice, trembling like the aftermath of a cruciatus. "Harry?" George's voice was low and urgent. I broke his mind," Harry whispered when he could speak again. He was an occlumen's. Some part of him was still awake. I pushed until I broke through it and his mind just crumbled. George's expression warred between worried and satisfied. "Nothing he didn't deserve," he finally said. "We need to get out of here." Harry straightened. "Yeah, I'll manage." He glanced at Lucius. "Do you want the honor?" George twirled his wand between his fingers. A flicker of indecision crossed his face. Then the expression hardened. "Well, if you're offering your lordship..." The wand stopped and came to rest, aimed perfectly at the unmoving body. "For every time you tried to kill a Weasley," George spat. "For every time Ginny woke up screaming, 'Dirimo!'" Lucius's body jerked. Then it was still, not even breathing anymore. Ronnikins found it in one of the black books. "It tears apart whatever inside bit of the body that happened to annoy you," George murmured. "I'm afraid old Lucius's heart is in several pieces now." Definitely dark. Not unforgivable, although Harry was pretty sure it could easily have been up there. A killing curse at least was quick and painless, as long as you weren't stupid enough to survive it. Several more spells took care of any traces they might have left. With Lucius dead and Narcissa out of it, they just needed to keep an eye on the house elves and Malfoy the younger. They could risk using magic a little more freely now. They still left the manor as swiftly and quietly as they could and crossed the gardens at a run, apparating as soon as they were clear of the wards. The uproar, Harry knew, would be massive. They had not made Lucius's death look like natural causes in the least. It might have worked, but they had decided against it. Harry wanted the rest of Malfoy's kind out there to fear. He wanted them to know that someone, somewhere, was targeting Death Eaters and was able to get through the Malfoy wards unseen. They had left no hint of their identity, but he still wouldn't be surprised if he was brought in for questioning. Not with the sort of interest the auras had started to take in him. Harry returned Grimmauld Place shortly before 4 that morning. On the couch he found Ron and Hermione, both asleep and likely waiting for him. He absently cast the charm to clear the spell record on his wand. Then he gently expanded the couch and conjured a blanket before he settled into sleep, careful not to wake up his 2 best friends. "I found some occlumency theory," Harry told Hermione quietly that morning, when they were all awake and mostly rested. Ron was in the shower. Hermione had brought out a book that could have doubled as a bedside table. Both of them had very carefully not asked him anything about the night before, beyond making sure he and George were both all right. "I'll write it down for you," he continued. "I won't be able to test you." Hermione had made him practice occasionally. They had been very careful, but it wasn't until now he understood the sort of risk they had run repeatedly. He would never do it again, not with the memories of Lucius Malfoy's mind breaking beneath his spell, not with the nightmares he would have of a human being reduced to little more than a Dementor victim from nothing more than the force of his magic. He could cast it on enemies, sure. He would break his vow and bear the consequences before he ever cast it on a friend. Hermione watched him for a long time. Then she nodded. All right. She didn't ask. Harry didn't offer. The Malfoy death murder, Harry readily admitted, did not make the Morning Prophet. They made up for that with a special evening edition dedicated to nothing else. A reformed pillar of society, brutally murdered in his own bed behind some of the best defences available to wizarding kind. The Prophet would milk the story for weeks, months, Harry figured, if they managed to dig up some particularly juicy details or got inside information on the investigation. They had a number of pictures of Lucius Malfoy looking important and respectable, along with pictures of his family. A few of them featured Draco as new head of the Malfoy family, looking paler than he ever had at Hogwarts. There was a long article about Lucius's many contributions to wizarding society, and an equally long sympathetic article about his youthful struggles and sacrifices for his family and resilience in the face of opposition and prejudice. The fact that Rita Skeeter was in Azkaban hadn't improved the Prophet's journalism much. There was a surprising lack of details about the murder itself. Harry suspected that was Narcissa Malfoy's doing, since aura information made the circuit only slightly slower than Hogwarts gossip. The letters in the Prophet were mostly supportive and full of shock and indignant rage. If anyone thought Malfoy had it coming, they wisely stayed quiet about it. The going theory was revenge rogue Death Eaters out to get even with a brave man who stood strong against their master when others had faltered. That one got a small smile from Harry. In another world where they hadn't gone after the Lestranges, it could very well have been the right theory too. As it was, Harry and George had stolen their plans wholesale, so he supposed rogue Death Eaters did play a big part in it. There were a number of other crackpot theories, but none that Harry paid attention to, beyond making sure their names weren't brought up. He went through the memories from Malfoy the best he could, and let a dictation quill write everything down as he spoke for hours about everything he could remember. His dreams the following nights were an unpleasant mix of those memories and his own nightmares. A pensieve would have been extremely useful, but the only one they knew of was in Hogwarts and well out of reach. Well, technically, Harry knew about 2 now, but the second was in Malfoy Manor, and very much out of reach as well. Instead, they made do the best they could. One thing they did act on almost immediately was the memory of the Malfoy country house, or, more accurately, as Harry noted, a convenient place to house lesser visitors or the occasional mistress, a respectable number of miles away from the proper estate. Lucius had made little use of it himself, and the memories were of a small, stuffy manor house with stale air that was only rarely visited even by house elves. Lucius Malfoy's memories meant that the wards, far weaker than those on the proper Malfoy Manor, were easily bypassed without alerting whoever held the wards now. Narcissa or Draco, Harry didn't know, nor did he particularly care. An hour later, the house and the small surrounding garden were gone, whisked away by the Fidelius like they never even existed. Days passed, then a week. Harry knew better than to assume the silence was good news. Ron and Hermione's tension told him they agreed. Susan's Patronus arrived 8 days after the murder. They want to bring you in for questioning. Then softer. Good luck. Harry, Ron, and Hermione exchanged a look. Potter Cottage? Ron asked. Better than waiting for the wards to alert us, Harry agreed. Probably less suspicious. They weren't about to move into the cottage, but it still had to be able to pass for somewhere they actually lived. A number of spells had been put into place to give them advance warning of any visitors, but even then it was minutes at the most. Harry apparated to Potter Cottage alone. He didn't want to draw the aura's attention to Ron or Hermione. They didn't like it, but they all agreed that it was better to have backup in Grimmauld if he needed it. A flick of his wand made the cold fireplace come to life. Another few flicks and a teacup had settled on the table, along with the morning's copy of The Prophet. In the kitchen, the kettle had woken up as well. A few minutes, and the cottage looked and felt like an actual home again, the faint smell of wood smoke mingling with tea. He was in the middle of the Prophet's crossword, 8 down, the unfinished musical composition banned since 1902 when the wards alerted him to guests. 3, by the feel of it. Harry put aside the paper, finished his tea, and got up to meet the Aurors at the door. Harry didn't know the Auror with the Veritaserum, nor did he particularly care. He could sense Shacklebolt nearby, though, even if he couldn't see him. The man was strong and his magic familiar. He was observing the questioning, probably. Harry supposed he should feel flattered the minister took time out of his busy schedule for that sort of thing. The Auror went through the usual test of antidote and memory charms, then fed Harry the 3 drops of potion. The world fell away around him. Only the warmth of his bonds and endless months of exposure to the potion's effects remained as a grounding force in the emptiness and gave him some control. "What is your name?" "Harry James Potter," he answered truthfully. There was a quill scribbling down every word they spoke for all the good that would do. "Did you kill Lucius Malfoy?" Harry did not even need to use his bonds for that question. "No," he answered truthfully. Broke his mind, yes, but he hadn't cast the final curse. "Did you participate, assist, or were you in any other way involved in the murder of Lucius Malfoy?" Even to his detached mind, the questions felt familiar. He supposed they had rules about questions and how to phrase them. The question was straining the limit of the bonds. They had known the plans, but they hadn't helped, hadn't even talked about them since that first day they went through the papers, and that was enough that Ron, with his wonderful black and white view of the world, could truthfully say, "No." "Do you know who were involved in the murder of Lucius Malfoy?" The compulsion of the Veritaserum strained against the bond. Worse than Voldemort's Imperius, and without the pleasant desire to simply give in, only endless training runs with Ron and Hermione kept the answer from crossing his lips before he could stop it. Hermione would be no help. Her mind was too analytical, too happy to question everything. Ron was the one who could stubbornly take things at face value if he had to, and stick to his version, come hell or high water. Ron was very, very sure he knew who was involved in the murder, but he hadn't asked, and he had no proof, and for all that he knew there might have been others involved too, and that was enough to appease the compulsion. Barely. No. Harry could feel relief even through the effects of the potions, the adrenaline of a barely dodged unforgivable. "Where were you on the night of the murder of Lucius Malfoy, Tuesday the 7th of this month?" Only the fact that he was not the secret keeper kept him from blurting out the name of Grimmauld Place when he pulled on Hermione's bond. Distantly he wondered if he could have named it, if he had bonded with George as well. "Asleep, at home," he stated, keeping Ron and Hermione's names out of it. "Where?" The aura sounded more insistent this time. "I am not the secret keeper." Truth. Let them make of that what they wanted. He didn't like giving up the knowledge of the Fidelius, but he would be surprised if the headmistress hadn't told Shacklebolt about Hermione's interest in the spell after Harry's behaviour in Hogwarts. She had probably told him about Harry's apparent ability to lie under Veritaserum, too. The unnatural silence of a spell settled around him, blocking off all sound. He felt both Ron and Hermione in the back of his mind, as anxious as he felt. He was almost sure what the next question would be. They all were, and he knew just as well he couldn't lie his way around it through the bonds. How much would Shacklebolt let them get away with? None of them knew any more. He couldn't lie about the identity of the secret keeper since all 3 of them knew, but there were other options. Harry would find a way to keep his mouth shut if it came to that. He had enough training with the potion that he might be able to stay silent when it was something this important to him. Otherwise, well, hard to talk without a tongue. The silence stretched on. Finally the spell was lifted and the antidote administered. The haze cleared. Harry looked up to meet Kingsley Shacklebolt's dark eyes. "Potter Cottage isn't under a Fidelius." Harry didn't answer. Shacklebolt made it sound like an important piece of information, but they both knew it said very little. The Fidelius could have been cast on part of the property. It could have been another place entirely. It didn't even necessarily have to be Harry's property he was referring to. They wanted to ask the identity of the secret keeper. Shacklebolt continued. "I refused permission. It goes far beyond what they're allowed to during a normal questioning, and I don't think any of us want to find out what lengths you would go to keep the name safe." Probably sensible. Ignoring what it might have done to Harry himself, the fallout if a well-known, influential person like him came to harm in ministry hands during a routine questioning would be significant. Harry stayed silent, though, and Shacklebolt sighed. "That was all. You're free to leave." Harry stood. Only then did he speak. "Thank you, Minister." Something flickered through Shacklebolt's eyes. It might have been concern. It might have been suspiciousness. Harry was too exhausted to care. Christmas hit with the force of a bludger. They had all had other things to worry about, and it came as a genuine surprise to open his eyes one morning and realize that it was Christmas. They spent it in the Burrow. There had never been a question about it. The whole family and every honorary member out there showed up. Charlie was back from Romania for a full week. Bill and Fleur, 4 months pregnant and practically glowing, would stay for the Christmas days. Percy and Audrey, who had been introduced to the family before, but would be exposed to the full chaos of a Weasley Christmas for the first time. Andromeda was there with Teddy, having refused to let her grandson spend his first real Christmas in the silence of the Tonks home. Ginny and Luna still living at home. George and Lee dragged along when George realized that Lee's family was out of the country for the holiday, and that just wouldn't do. And even Neville had managed to convince his grandmother to let him visit for a few hours. "We wrote him," Hermione said quietly, when they had found a quiet spot on the outskirts of the light and noise and warmth. "Ron and I. We wanted everyone here." Most of it could very likely have been for Molly's sake, Harry knew, but not Neville. Molly barely knew him. Neville was there for Harry, and all of them knew why. It hung over all of them, the heavy feeling of a world about to go mad again. Not just Ron and Hermione and Harry, but all those in the know. Harry could see the same stubborn determination in Neville to enjoy the holidays while he had them, to enjoy the warmth and laughter of a crowded house. He could see it in the tension in George's stance, in the way he never really relaxed entirely. He could see it in the lingering glances from Bill and Fleur, and in the way Ginny avoided him, and Luna kept her distracted. "We wanted everyone here," Hermione didn't say, "because this could be the last time we'll have the chance." Harry had already drawn too much attention. The auras were already too interested in him. It was only a matter of time now. "You don't have to do this," Bill said, low and urgent in the brief seconds they happened to be alone in the kitchen. "You can still back out." "No," Harry said, "I can't." Bill looked like he wanted to argue more, but the door had opened and Molly had arrived and the chance was gone. Neville gripped his shoulder tightly when the rest of the Weasleys had said their goodbyes and Christmas greetings, and Harry had followed him to the edge of the wards. "Call us, we'll answer," he promised, stubborn and defiant. "Bloody hell, Neville," Harry breathed. "This isn't your fight." Neville shrugged. "It is now. We're Gryffindors, Harry. No common sense between us. The wizarding world expected you to fix everything when we were in Hogwarts. They can't complain if you do the same now." He glanced back at the Burrow, bright and inviting. "Would I have liked a little more peace before it all started again? Sure, life's full of disappointments like that. Go back inside, Harry. You'll have to be Lord Potter soon enough. Just remember that we'll answer, and I'll make Ron hex you if you forget that." Harry gripped Neville's hand tightly in return. It was all the answer he needed to give. They celebrated the New Year together, just the three of them. They fell asleep on the couch in a mess of pillows and blankets, listened to the muted sound of celebrations outside, and allowed themselves the rare luxury of simply sleeping in. The wards on Potter Cottage pulled Harry out of sound sleep shortly before noon on the first day of the new year. A few quick spells got him dressed and presentable, and Hermione pushed an invigoration draught into his hand. "Go!" Apparition brought him from Grimold to the cottage with just enough time to down the potion and vanish the bottle. The grogginess of sleep left, replaced by the sharp clarity of the potion. 3 people by the door, according to the wards. Harry opened it to find a trio of auras on his doorstep, one a bit older than the others. One of them looked familiar, too, enough so that Harry could say with absolute certainty that it was Theodore Knott's older aura brother. His sharp smile did not promise good news. "Harry James Potter," the older aura spoke and held out a sealed scroll. By order of the Ministry, I have a warrant for your arrest for the suspected murder of Lucius Malfoy. You will surrender your wand. Your solicitor, should you have one, will be contacted by the Ministry. Any attempts to refuse these orders will result in your arrest by force." Time stood still, frozen solid in that one instant. To Harry it felt like balancing on a cliff's edge and not sure which way was solid ground and which was empty air and a terrifying fall. Aura headquarters were warded. There would be no way out but fighting. The Auras had no proof. George and Harry had both made very sure of that. But they had strong enough suspicions to arrest him, and he had too many secrets he could not protect under Veritaserum. Going with them was almost certain to see him sent to Azkaban, and Ron and Hermione with him. Resisting would turn him into a wanted fugitive, and would be all but a confession of guilt. But then they always knew it would come to that. A spark of fiend fire sprang to life. If he was about to condemn himself, then he would do it right, prove that it was not just a moment of panic or an unfortunate misunderstanding. I am Harry James Potter, and I choose this willingly. Time moved again, slow and sluggish. Harry watched calmly as the Auras aimed their wands and fired a trio of stunners in painfully drawn-out motions. He had an eternity to act, and he didn't even bother to shield, merely sidestepped the spells and moved backwards inside the cottage in the same motion. Harry raised his hand and breathed magic into his fiend fire. Flames exploded and time snapped into place, and the oldest of the Auras had just enough time to see his end approach. A monstrous owl took flight on wings of fire and swallowed his scream before he could form it. Intense heat struck Harry, bit into his skin, and burned away his sweat before it could form. But he didn't flinch. The cottage was burning already, even with the fiend fire reined in. Cinders turned into ash, turned into nothing before it could touch him, and a single moment of inattention would see the spell turn on him. An infernal phoenix rose from the flames, spread its wings gracefully, and descended upon the second Aura. Not screamed once, embraced by burning wings and white-hot feathers, and not even ashes were left. The last Aura seemed to be frozen in terror at the wall of fiend fire, and Harry reined it in before it could claim its third victim. He forced it to part and stepped between twin pillars of fire where the outer wall and door had been, watching the Aura all the while. Something collapsed behind him, likely the staircase, and a cloud of embers surged into the room and was gone again. Harry was honestly surprised the man hadn't apparated yet. Then again, fiend fire wasn't something most people had grown used to dealing with, and certainly not seeing someone incinerated by it. He waited until the man actually focused on him with wide, horrified eyes. Only then did he speak, sharp and precise to make sure he would not be misunderstood. "I have had quite enough of wizarding prejudices and rampant racism. Go back to the Minister, Aura. Tell him that if takes a Dark Lord to change it, then a Dark Lord he will get." The man visibly swallowed, still frozen. Harry idly raised his wand. The pillars of flame rose with it, with the roar of malevolent magic. That was enough to snap the Aura out of it. He apparated with a sharp crack, and Harry was marginally impressed that he managed to do it without leaving any body parts behind. Burning wood groaned behind him. The walls had cracked from the heat, and the air was heavy with the smell of fire and magic and death. His bond was unnaturally silent, Ron and Hermione's familiar presence vivid in his mind, but none of them speaking. Harry took one last look at the doomed cottage. Then he lowered his wand, released the fiend fire to run rampant, and apparated to Grimmauld with a sharp crack as the world around him became a living inferno. We hope you enjoyed this chapter. Please consider supporting our project by joining our Patreon linked in the description, or become a member here on YouTube, where you will get access to several additional chapters weeks before they release on YouTube.